February 24th, 2022, 5 a.m. Kyiv, Ukraine. The city was still dark. The streets were empty. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and a thin layer of frost clung to the cobblestones of the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square. The same square where, 8 years earlier, a revolution had been born in fire and blood. Most of Kyiv's 3.5 million residents were asleep. Children were in their beds. Mothers had not yet risen to make breakfast. Old men had not yet shuffled to their windows to watch the pale winter sun crawl over the Dnipro River. The city breathed slowly, the way cities do in those last precious minutes before the world changes forever. And then, without warning, without mercy, without any final diplomatic gesture that could have changed the course of what followed, the sky cracked open. Explosions tore through the pre-dawn silence, like the earth itself was being ripped apart at the seams. Air raid sirens, the sound of a nightmare made real, began to wail across every district of the capital. Missile strikes were already hitting military infrastructure on the outskirts of the city. And hundreds of kilometers away, on the borders of Belarus to the north, Russia to the east, and Crimea to the south, a military force of over 190,000 Russian troops began to move. Vladimir Putin had given the order. The largest land invasion in Europe since the Second World War had begun. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, at this particular darkness, one must go back. Not just to 2014, when Russian forces first seized Crimea in a swift and almost bloodless operation that stunned Western capitals. Not just to the Minsk agreements that followed, those fragile ceasefire deals that both sides signed and neither side truly honored. One must go back further to the cold, quiet offices of the Kremlin in the years after the Soviet Union collapsed, where a young intelligence officer named Vladimir Putin watched the greatest geopolitical humiliation of the 20th century unfold in real time and made himself a silent, iron promise. Putin had described the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Those were not the words of a man who had made peace with history. Those were the words of a man building a case, constructing brick by brick, a justification for what he believed was an inevitable restoration. For 2 decades, he had consolidated power inside Russia with a ruthlessness that analysts in Washington, London, and Brussels had consistently underestimated. He had dismantled opposition, imprisoned critics, and built a vertical of power so total that by 2022, the Russian state and Vladimir Putin were, for all practical purposes, the same entity. And Ukraine? Sovereign, democratic, westward-leaning Ukraine had become, in his mind, not a neighboring nation, but an existential provocation. The tension had been building for months before the first missile was ever fired. Throughout late 2021, American intelligence agencies, the CIA under Director William Burns, the NSA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency had been tracking an extraordinary buildup of Russian military forces along Ukraine's borders. Satellite imagery showed field hospitals being established. Fuel depots were being stocked at levels consistent not with exercises, but with sustained military campaigns. Blood supplies were being moved forward. These were not the signs of a bluff. William Burns, a career diplomat who had served as U.S. ambassador to Moscow and understood Putin's worldview with rare precision, flew personally to Kyiv in January 2022 to brief President Volodymyr Zelensky. The message was direct and deeply alarming. Russia was not posturing. The invasion was real, and it was coming. Zelensky, a former comedian and television actor who had risen to the presidency on a platform of anti-corruption and national renewal, listened carefully. He had been living under the shadow of Russian aggression since the day he took office. But even a man who had spent 3 years navigating the impossible pressures of leading a nation half the world wanted to use as a chess piece, struggled to fully absorb the scale of what was coming. Joe Biden, in the weeks leading up to the invasion, made a decision that would define his presidency and divide his legacy in equal measure. He authorized the release of classified intelligence to the public, an unprecedented move designed to strip Putin of the element of surprise and rally Western allies before the first shot was fired. In press conference after press conference, American officials named dates, described Russian military formations, and warned explicitly that an invasion was imminent. Some European allies were skeptical. Some accused Washington of warmongering. The German government, deeply dependent on Russian natural gas flowing through the Nord Stream pipeline, urged restraint. France's Emmanuel Macron flew to Moscow and sat at the absurdly long table in the Kremlin. That table which seemed almost theatrical in its length, as though Putin was staging the humiliation of his visitors as much as conducting diplomacy, and spoke with Putin for hours. He left with nothing. The diplomatic window, if it had ever truly been open, was now closed, sealed shut from the inside. When the invasion began, the early hours were catastrophic and disorienting in equal measure. Russian forces moved on three axes simultaneously: from the north through Belarus toward Kyiv, from the east toward Kharkiv and the Donbas region, and from the south out of Crimea toward Kherson and Mariupol. Russian military planners had expected Kyiv to fall within 72 hours. There were reports, later confirmed by multiple intelligence sources, that Russian logistics units had packed their dress uniforms for a victory parade through the Ukrainian capital. The plan, in its conception, was not a war. It was an annexation dressed as a military operation. Putin had reportedly told his inner circle that Ukrainian resistance would collapse, that the government would flee, and that the population, which he had publicly claimed was not a separate people but merely misguided Russians, would welcome the arrival of Russian forces with relief, perhaps even with flowers. He was catastrophically wrong. Volodymyr Zelensky did not flee. In the early hours of the invasion, as foreign governments offered evacuation assistance and some of his own advisors urged him to leave the capital for his own safety, Zelensky made a decision that would reverberate through the entire arc of the war. He stayed. He picked up a phone, filmed himself on the streets of Kyiv, surrounded by his senior staff, and broadcast a message to his people and to the world. His words were simple. He was here. His government was here. They were not putting down their weapons. Ukraine was not falling. In that single act, unscripted, unpolished, filmed on a mobile phone in the dark streets of a city under attack, Zelensky transformed himself from a politician into a symbol. And symbols, as history has proven again and again, are extraordinarily difficult to defeat with tanks and missiles. The battle for Kyiv became the first great turning point of the war. Russian armored columns advancing from Belarus became bogged down on roads that Ukrainian forces had anticipated and prepared. The famous convoy, a miles-long column of Russian tanks and military vehicles that stretched across satellite images like a vast mechanical serpent, stalled north of the capital, vulnerable and exposed. Ukrainian forces, armed with anti-tank weapons supplied by the United States and United Kingdom, including the now legendary Javelin missiles and British NLAW systems, struck at the column with devastating precision. Russian logistics, always the Achilles heel of large mechanized armies operating far from their supply bases, began to break down. Tanks ran out of fuel. Soldiers, some of whom had reportedly been told they were going on training exercises, found themselves stranded in hostile territory with no clear orders and no understanding of why the local population, which they had been told would welcome them, was shooting at them. By the end of March 2022, in a development that stunned military analysts across the world, Russian forces withdrew from the Kyiv region entirely. It was framed by Moscow as a goodwill gesture toward ongoing peace negotiations in Istanbul. Nobody believed it. The retreat from Kyiv was a military defeat, the first major strategic failure of a war that Putin had expected to last days, but which was now clearly going to last far, far longer. And when Ukrainian forces moved back into the liberated towns north of Kyiv, into places like Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel, what they found there would change the moral character of the entire conflict. In Bucha, the bodies of civilians were found in the streets. Some had their hands bound behind their backs, evidence of summary executions, of torture, of deliberate atrocities committed against non-combatants accumulated rapidly. The images that came out of Bucha circled the globe within hours. They were met with horror in Western capitals, with outrage at the United Nations, and with flat denial from Moscow. Russia claimed the images were staged. The evidence said otherwise. The war ground on. Mariupol, the strategic port city on the Sea of Azov, became the site of the conflict's most prolonged and devastating urban siege. Ukrainian forces, including fighters of the Azov Regiment, held out inside the massive Azovstal steel plant for weeks against overwhelming Russian firepower.
The siege of Azovstal became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, in the same way that certain sieges in history had become symbols. Not because the defenders could win, but because of how long and how fiercely they refused to lose. Eventually, under a negotiated evacuation, the remaining defenders surrendered. But the world had watched. And what the world saw in those tunnels and bunkers beneath the steel plant, wounded soldiers, civilian families who had sheltered underground for months, men and women who had chosen captivity over abandonment, added another layer of moral weight to a conflict that was already reshaping how the world understood sovereignty, resistance, and the cost of freedom. NATO, as an institution, found itself navigating the most dangerous tightrope in its 70-year history. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, repeated the alliance's core position with the precision of a man who understood that every word he spoke was being parsed in Moscow, Washington, and every European capital simultaneously. NATO would support Ukraine. NATO would not send troops into Ukraine. The line between support and direct involvement was drawn with great care and defended with great anxiety. Because on the other side of that line lay the possibility of a confrontation between nuclear powers. A possibility that no responsible leader could approach without the full weight of what that meant pressing down on every decision. The weapons packages grew larger. Artillery systems, air defense batteries, eventually, tanks. Eventually, longer-range missiles. Each escalation debated, delayed, decided. Each delivery changing the arithmetic of the battlefield by degrees. Vladimir Putin, facing a war that had not gone according to any of his calculations, escalated in the only direction available to a man unwilling to admit failure. In September 2022, he announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. In ceremonies held in Moscow, signing documents that declared these territories to be permanently and irrevocably part of the Russian Federation. It was an act with no legal standing under international law. It was rejected immediately by the United Nations General Assembly, which passed a resolution condemning the annexations with 143 votes in favor. It was, in the cold language of geopolitics, a performance of power by a man whose actual power on the battlefield was being steadily eroded. Because even as Putin signed those annexation documents, Ukrainian forces were in the process of liberating significant portions of the very territories he was claiming. The gap between the map Putin was drawing and the map that existed in reality grew wider with every passing week. The war entered its grinding, attritional phase, the phase that wars enter when neither side can deliver a decisive blow, but neither side is willing to accept the terms the other would require for peace. Thousands of kilometers of front lines, drone warfare evolving in real time, with both sides adapting tactics faster than doctrine could follow. Ukrainian engineers and their Western partners developing new countermeasures. Russian forces adapting, absorbing losses, and pushing forward with the grim arithmetic of a state willing to spend human lives at a rate that democratic governments could not politically sustain. The casualty figures, disputed, impossible to verify with precision, staggering in any estimate, told the story of a war that was consuming a generation of young men on both sides of the line. And behind the front lines, in the cities and towns of Ukraine that Russian missiles continued to strike throughout the war, civilians paid the price that civilians always pay when great powers decide that the territory beneath their feet is worth more than the lives living on it. This is not a story with a clean ending. It cannot be, because it is not yet over. What it will remain in the memory of the world for decades, is a story about the moment when the post-Cold War order, the fragile architecture of rules and agreements and institutions that had been built on the rubble of the 20th century's catastrophes, was directly and violently challenged. It is a story about a man in the Kremlin who believed that history owed him an empire. It is a story about a people who decided, collectively and at enormous cost, that they would rather bleed than bow. It is a story about the West, imperfect, divided, slow, and ultimately consequential, finding, in the face of naked aggression, something resembling a spine. And it is a story about every soldier in every trench, on every freezing night along that vast and terrible front line, who woke up each morning not knowing if this would be the day the war ended, or the day it ended them. The guns are still firing, the drones are still flying, the dead are still being counted, and the world is still watching, waiting to find out what kind of century this is going to be.